When we talk about famous revolutions in world history, it is undeniable that the French Revolution is one of the most important events impacting not only Europe but the entire world. The revolution liberated progressive French social ideals from the suppression of the feudal system, becoming a major threat to the existence of feudal nations at the time. The French Revolution brought immense inspiration to the European intellectual class, making them believe that people could truly make society better. It became the starting point for the development of all modern political ideologies, leading to the birth and popularization of many great philosophies. Why did the French Revolution begin? How did it unfold? Let us find out in the following script written by the author Tran Phan from the Spy Room. The Road to Revolution. Originally, France was not the unified bloc it is today. The French territory back then was a collection of many distinct lands and political entities. During the Roman Empire era, the land that would later become France belonged to a region called Gaul. After the Western Roman Empire collapsed, it gradually became part of Charlemagne's Frankish Empire. After the Frankish Empire fractured, its western part became West Francia, which was the predecessor of the medieval Kingdom of France. And the glue that held the regions within this kingdom together was the French monarchy and the power of the Church. In this system, the king represented political and military power, while the Church provided spiritual strength. These two pillars maintained the stability of France for many centuries. Over time, the national consciousness of the French people gradually formed. The people began to feel a shared bond, which was further strengthened by favourable natural conditions, especially the Central Plains and the Seine River, which helped border regions easily trade and connect. Thanks to this, France entered a period of centralised monarchy, becoming one of the most powerful nations in Europe, standing out in terms of economy, military and culture. Moving into the 17th century, French culture continued to flourish alongside the Enlightenment, an ideological movement with profound influence across Europe. The Enlightenment meant awakening human reason. Philosophers argued that reason, rather than religious faith, was the true tool to help humanity understand and improve the world. Therefore, they called for limiting the divine right of the Church and elevating freedom of thought. In France, this movement affirmed principles such as equality before the law, justice, natural human rights, and the idea that sovereignty belongs to the people. These ideas went completely against the hierarchical order of the contemporary monarchy. Great philosophers like Montesquieu, Voltaire, and Diderot developed these ideologies. But the most profoundly influential figure was Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a philosopher of Swiss origin. His works, such as The Social Contract and the Discourse on the Arts and Sciences, became the ideological foundation for the French Revolution. Specifically, The Social Contract emphasised that each person needs to sacrifice a part of their individual interests for the common good. This was a viewpoint that changed how people perceived the role of society and the state. However, despite being powerful militarily and ideologically, France in the 18th century was not an invincible empire. Losses in the War of the Spanish Succession and the 7 Years' War had left the national treasury severely depleted. Meanwhile, Britain, the eternal rival of the French, was thriving thanks to the early modernisation of its industry and commerce. The absolute monarchy itself also became a burden. While under the reign of Louis XIV, France was led by a highly capable and decisive king. His successors lacked political will and the ability to reform. By the 1780s, the economic situation grew increasingly worse within a nation that had long failed to modernise like Britain. Harsh winters, crop failures, and the threat of widespread famine loomed, while the royal court remained drowned in luxury and stagnation. And amidst a crisis spreading across the country, what was the King of France doing? Crisis of the old regime. The king ruling France at this time was Louis XVI, who was weak and poorly prepared to be a king. Louis XVI inherited a nation on the verge of decline. Throughout the 18th century, France constantly faced budget crises because state revenues could not keep up with expenditures. Although the economy grew quite sustainably, delegating tax collection to tax farmers meant this growth did not translate correspondingly into revenue for the national treasury. Worst of all, because the nobility and clergy enjoyed many privileges of tax exemption, the burden of taxation fell primarily on the lower classes of society. King Louis XVI and his finance ministers also wanted to reform the country, but the king did not dare to tax or limit the privileges of the nobles for fear of angering them and causing a civil war. On the other hand, most royal decrees had to be passed by the parliaments, which were similar to local parliaments across France. These parliaments believed that reforms would affect their interests, so they refused to support them. The conflict between the central government and the parliaments became a national crisis. Both sides issued a series of public statements to legitimise their actions. The central government claimed they were fighting against the special privileges of the ruling class. Meanwhile, the parliaments argued they were fighting for the traditions of the nation. Public opinion supported the parliaments, and massive protests took place in many towns. In August 1788, after numerous financial reports, Louis XVI was shocked to realise the French treasury was virtually empty. With no other choice, the king had to summon the Estates General to find a way to solve the problem. In September 1788, the Parliament of Paris ordered the summoning of the Estates General, bringing together all three classes, which were the clergy, the nobility, and the commoners. Traditionally, each estate would vote separately to determine its policies, and when counting votes, it was based only on the representative vote of each estate. Taking advantage of this structure, the clergy and nobility could collude to outvote the Third Estate, even though those two classes made up only 5% of the population. Following the relaxation of censorship on laws banning associations, a group of liberal nobles and middle-class activists, calling themselves the Society of 30, lobbied the king to double the number of delegates for the Third Estate and change the rule of voting by representative to voting by head. Emmanuel Joseph Size also published a highly influential political pamphlet titled What is the Third Estate?, aiming to denounce the special privileges of the clergy and nobility, while affirming that the Third Estate is the representative of the people and therefore deserves its own seat in the assembly. Political activists like Mounier, Barnave, and Robespierre organised rallies and filed petitions on behalf of the Third Estate in local towns. All of this led to the fact that in December 1788, Louis XVI accepted doubling the number of delegates for the Third Estate, but left it to the Estates General to consider granting the right to vote by head. For Louis XVI, this was a highly risky gamble because the Estates General was a political body that existed even before the absolute monarchy, back when the king's voice was still overshadowed by the nobles and clergy. The biggest risk that Louis XVI could suffer was that the Estates General had entirely enough power to threaten the royal family. The prime example was still there, as in 1649 Charles I of England was executed by Parliament for treason. But for Louis XVI, there was no more feasible way to revive his declining kingdom. The Estates General of 1789. Among the three estates, the first estate was the clergy, consisting of 303 delegates, representing about 100,000 clergymen. This class held nearly 10% of the total land area and a significant portion of the nation's tax revenue. However, the internal ranks of the priests and clergy were not unified at all. About 3/4 of them were simple parish priests who were close to the peasants, earning wages lower than even unskilled labourers. The remaining minority were wealthy bishops and abbots, who often had close ties to the royal court. This difference caused the clergy class to have internal class division, an important factor leading to the split later when the revolution broke out. The second estate was the nobility, with 322 delegates representing about 400,000 people. This class held 25% of the nation's land area, enjoyed many privileges, and had the right to collect taxes from the tenant farmers under their command. Just like the clergy, the noble class was also not unified. One group was the sword nobility, meaning traditional nobles with long-standing military backgrounds who lived in magnificent mansions. The other group was the robe nobility, those who were newly ennobled thanks to administrative or judicial work, or by holding positions in the state apparatus. In the Assembly of 1789, the majority of noble delegates belonged to the sword group, so conservative and anti-reform tendencies prevailed. The Third Estate was the most massive, being the commoners, with 610 delegates representing about 95% of the French population. About 2/3 of the delegates were lawyers or civil servants coming from the parliaments, yet many among them gained their social status through wealth rather than birth. Merchants and artisans made up a small percentage, while the peasants, the largest force in society, had absolutely no direct representation. The delegates of the Third Estate brought to the Assembly many grievance lists focusing on unfair taxation, feudal privileges, and equal rights before the law. A notable point is that the vast majority of the delegates of the Third Estate were young and lacked practical political experience. That youthfulness also meant they were ready to take risks to achieve their drastic political goals. On May 5th, 1789, the Assembly began meeting at the Palace of Versailles. Here, Finance Minister Jacques Necker briefly outlined the issues related to the state budget and reiterated the King's decision that each estate should agree on the issues they wanted to present so that all three parties could vote together. The next day, each estate verified the credentials of its own delegates. However, the Third Estate voted to invite the other estates to review all the delegates of the Assembly together and agree to count the votes by head. Unsuccessful negotiations dragged on until June 12th, forcing the Third Estate to just verify its own delegates. On June 17th, the Third Estate declared itself the National Assembly of France and invalidated all current taxes. By June 19th, over 100 delegates from the clergy had also joined the National Assembly. Shocked by the actions of the Third Estate, King Louis XVI agreed to announce the implementation of a reform during a royal session of the Estates General, with the Assembly Hall closed during the session. But ironically, the delegates of the Estates General were not informed about this in advance. On June 20th, seeing the hall closed without a clear reason, the delegates of the Third Estate moved to a nearby tennis court and swore not to disperse until a new constitution was passed. During the royal session, King Louis XVI announced a series of reforms and declared that no new taxes or loans would be enacted without the approval of the Estates General. However, right after that, he undermined his own position by reiterating the initial demand that all three estates must meet and vote separately. The Third Estate refused to leave the hall and reaffirmed their oath not to disband until a constitution was passed. By June 27th, facing a wave of mass protests and a mutiny by the French Guards, King Louis XVI was forced to order the members of the First and Second Estates to join the National Assembly. Constitutional monarchy. The inability of King Louis XVI to stop the delegates from forming the National Assembly clearly showed that the king's power was no longer absolute. Yet King Louis XVI continued to make wrong moves by listening to his younger brother and Queen Marie Antoinette, dismissing Finance Minister Necker on July 11th. This made the public even more resentful and hateful toward the king, as Necker was the one proposing the reform plans. On July 12th, the newly formed National Assembly held a meeting because there was a rumour that the king planned to mobilise the Swiss Guards to force the dissolution of the Assembly. This rumour caused a wave of protests to rise and finally erupt into a riot on July 14, 1789, when thousands of Parisians poured into the streets and advanced to attack the Bastille fortress. This was a fortified stronghold, a symbol of royal power, while also acting as a massive armoury for weapons and ammunition, and serving as a prison holding political prisoners. There were even some soldiers who joined the people in this attack. After 4 hours of fighting and dozens of people killed during the assault, the soldiers inside the fortress surrendered, the commander of the fortress was killed, his head was put on a pike, and paraded through the streets. All across France, peasants attacked the castles and mansions of the nobles, while in the urban areas, the situation gradually became chaotic. There were cases where nobles were robbed of their property, had their houses destroyed, or were even hanged. The people built their own armed militia forces, and King Louis XVI could not even control the situation. A large number of nobles, out of fear, sought ways to flee abroad. Initially, the National Assembly was worried about these actions and tried to minimise the damage, but at this point they realised this was truly a godsend opportunity. The National Assembly issued the august decrees declaring the abolition of the feudal system. All the arable land of the nobility and the church would now belong to the state. The decrees also called for freedom of religion, equality before the law, and the end of local privileges. In just 4 months, the parliaments were also entirely wiped out. The absolute monarchy of France had come to an end. On August 26, 1789, the National Assembly passed the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. The National Assembly now focused on drafting a constitution. Some people proposed a bicameral system, in which the upper house would be appointed by the king, and the king would also have the right to appoint ministers as well as veto legislation. However, on September 10th, the majority in the National Assembly voted in favour of a unicameral legislative body. The next day, the National Assembly approved a temporary veto power, meaning King Louis XVI could delay the implementation of laws but could not block them permanently. Food shortages and economic collapse also made the people dissatisfied with the pace of reform, leading to widespread unrest in Paris. The crisis reached its peak in late September 1789, when the Flanders Regiment arrived at Versailles to support the Royal Guards, and was treated to a lavish banquet, which was a customary practice. Radical newspapers described this event as a gluttonous binge, fueling public outrage. Meanwhile, the National Assembly also viewed the appearance of this force as a threat to them. On October 5th, many groups of women gathered and organised protests against the severe shortages and soaring food prices. The protest quickly turned into a riot when 7,000 people, after looting weapons, marched to Versailles, where they stormed into the National Assembly Hall to state their demands. When the National Guard arrived that day, the commander, the Marquis de Lafayette, convinced King Louis XVI that to ensure the safety of the royal family, he needed to return to Paris. The next morning, some protesters broke in and searched for Queen Marie Antoinette, but she managed to escape. They vandalised the palace and killed several royal guards. Eventually, order was restored, and the royal family, along with the National Assembly, left Versailles for Paris, under the escort of the National Guard. With no other choice, King Louis XVI was forced to accept the august decrees as well as the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. His title was changed from the King of France to the King of the French. This showed that instead of viewing France as his personal property, the king was now strictly dependent on the French people, and so a constitutional monarchy was established. The civil constitution of the clergy. Another important issue to resolve was religion. The complete separation of the church and the state was something the French had never done before. In fact, France had always been proud to be the eldest daughter of the Catholic Church. The church also owned a lot of land and had extensive influence on culture, society, and economic life. Furthermore, many priests and clergymen supported the French government in administration, economic development, and building solidarity among the entire nation. On July 12th, the National Assembly passed the most disastrous thing, the civil constitution of the clergy. This constitution required the clergy across France to accept the state's nationalisation and confiscation of church properties, and clergymen had to become government officials and receive state salaries. This meant the French government not only took away the church's assets, but also directly infringed upon their religious views. Many clergymen also resisted because they believed the power of the church was far greater than that of the state. This led to the state carrying out purges of the clergymen who dared to resist. A great number of people were forced into execution or exile, ultimately leading to a highly infamous historical event called the War in the Vendée. The Vendée, a land located in western France, was the area most affected by the revolution. It was a poor region situated between two wealthy regions, Gironde and Brittany, and the nobles in this area were actually not as rich as the nobles in other regions. The clergymen in the Vendée were also mostly locals. Therefore, the local peasants here had a very good relationship with the nobility. The clergymen here were also respected by the people. In reality, members of the First and Second Estates in the Vendée uniformly organised funding and ran charities for the people. The civil constitution stripped all of that away from them. Besides damaging the region's economy and impacting society, the vast majority of peasants in the Vendée viewed the massacre of nobles and forcing them to leave, as well as confiscating church property, as an unjust act. Not to mention that although theoretically most of the property confiscated by the state would be divided among the people, in reality the new petty bourgeois merchants were the ones who hoarded almost all of it. These merchants also did not have much sympathy for the commoners, especially when they imposed taxes on the people during hard times. All of this, combined with a conscription order, forced the people of the Vendée to rebel. The rebellion taking place in the Vendée would haunt the Republic for many years to come, as the people continuously rebelled no matter how many times they were crushed. Many war crimes also occurred during this time, to the point that by the time the revolution ended, at least 200,000 people had died. After King Louis XVI returned to Paris, the political situation in the capital generally remained stable. However, in rural areas, the dismantling of the entire feudal administrative apparatus before establishing a replacement mechanism led to chaos and loss of control. By the spring of 1790, the divisions within the Constituent Assembly grew increasingly deep. This body gradually fractured into three main political blocs: the centrist faction represented by Size, Lafayette and Mirabeau, the royalist faction led by Maury, and the radical faction under the leadership of the historical figure Maximilien Robespierre. Even though Size tried to call for unity, the assembly still fell into severe polarisation. Especially the Jacobin Club, which started as a political discussion forum, quickly developed into an organised force with over 150 members and an increasingly spreading influence. In early 1791, the National Assembly enacted the Le Chapelier Law, banning the formation of trade unions and strike activities. This act was supported by the bourgeoisie, but caused deep disappointment among the working class. These were the people who were already facing a food crisis and demanding better living conditions. Besides that, the military situation had severely deteriorated. Because the officer corps mostly came from the nobility, people who inherently did not accept the new order, a massive number of them defected abroad, causing the combat capability and order-maintaining capacity of the army to significantly weaken. In that chaotic political and social context, King Louis XVI increasingly lost his calm and steadiness, becoming easily swayed by the pressure of the circumstances. After being stripped of most of his power and placed under the supervision of the National Assembly, the king decided to find a way to leave Paris to seek the help of European monarchies. Following the advice of Queen Marie Antoinette, he planned to go to Montemedi, where General Bouy was commanding about 10,000 loyal soldiers. However, the escape in June 1791 quickly failed. After just one day, the king's convoy was discovered in Varennes and forced to return to Paris. The escape became a decisive turning point that completely shattered the trust of the Parisian people in King Louis XVI. In the eyes of the public, this action was clear evidence that the king was no longer loyal to the nation, but was ready to ally with foreign powers, especially Austria, the Queen's homeland, to restore the monarchy and threaten national security. The direct consequence was that the National Assembly required all citizens to swear an oath of loyalty to the Constitution, while preparing for the possibility of war breaking out with European powers. In Paris, an atmosphere of suspicion and fear took over. Rumours of treason, spies, and overthrow plots spread everywhere. Even so, the centrist faction, which advocated maintaining the constitutional monarchy, still held the upper hand in the National Assembly. They argued that deposing the royal family and establishing a republic was a risky move, especially when the only successful republican model in Europe at the time was the Dutch Republic, a small and unique country. In August 1791, aware of the situation in France, King Frederick William II of Prussia and Emperor Leopold II of the Holy Roman Empire declared they would support King Louis XVI and threatened to invade France if the king was threatened. At the same time, the constitution drafted earlier by the French National Assembly was officially passed to establish a constitutional monarchy, but the divided state of the Assembly was still no better. Specifically, the Constitution of 1791 stipulated that a constitutional monarchy was established, with a clear separation of powers, and the king still held significant authority. However, King Louis XVI continued to make a wrong move by constantly using his veto power against laws targeting disobedient clergy and the confiscation of property from fleeing nobles. This made the people suspect he was betraying the revolution, something hard to blame them for, as people started reviewing correspondence and believed the king was plotting something with refugee nobles abroad. The Girondin faction at this time also made an equally disastrous move by supporting a military campaign against Austria and Prussia, both to provoke the king and because they wanted to export the revolution, meaning to spread the values of liberty and the revolutionary spirit. Queen Marie Antoinette, who was the de facto leader of the royalist faction at this time, also supported the war because she believed that through this, the royal family could regain control of the army and end the revolution. Robespierre's Jacobin faction opposed this extreme approach of the Girondins because, no matter how you looked at it, France was still not prepared for war. And according to their words, if they continued the war like this, a military dictatorship would inevitably happen. Freedom cannot be exported on the point of a bayonet, the Jacobins declared. However, by early 1792, the deep division within the Constituent Assembly caused political power to fall into the hands of the Girondins. In the context of the alliance between Austria and Prussia massing troops on the eastern border, the National Assembly decided to declare war on these two powers with the hope that victory would consolidate the position of the young republic. However, the expectations were completely contrary to reality. The French army, already severely weakened after years of chaos and lack of discipline, as well as losing a massive number of noble-born officers, quickly suffered consecutive defeats against the Austro-Prussian coalition. The enemy forces were commanded by Charles William Ferdinand, the Duke of Brunswick, a veteran and highly experienced general. Nevertheless, Brunswick committed a severe strategic error when he issued the Brunswick Manifesto. The manifesto warned that if King Louis XVI or the French royal family were harmed, the Allied forces would punish Paris with violence, even threatening to massacre civilians. And the result was more contrary to Brunswick's expectations than ever. Instead of making the French fearful, this threat fueled the rage of the masses, and they called for an end to the monarchy. On August 10th, 1792, thousands of militiamen and Parisian workers attacked the Tuileries Palace, the residence of the royal family, and slaughtered the Swiss guards protecting the king. By 11 in the morning that same day, the National Assembly announced the suspension of Louis XVI's royal authority and ended the Bourbon dynasty. From then on, the king was no longer called Louis XVI, but simply citizen Louis Capet, like an ordinary citizen and equal before the law. The monarchy in France had dissolved in just one morning, the First Republic. In late August 1792, the French National Assembly held elections, initiating a new political era. However, right within the revolutionary faction, divisions began to form. Three prominent forces emerged. The moderate Girondin faction, advocating for economic freedom and opposing extremism. The Montagnards within the Jacobin faction, led by Robespierre, who had radical tendencies, and the remaining centrist faction. In an atmosphere of suspicion and instability, France sank deep into chaos. In September 1792, out of fear of rebellion, the revolutionary government ordered the execution of over 1,000 prisoners, including many women and children. At the same time on the battlefield, the French army was losing badly, losing Longwy and Verdun to the Prussian army, causing domestic morale to plummet. However, the turning point came on September 20th, 1792, at Valmy. Under the command of two generals, Dumouriez and Kellerman, the revolutionary army successfully fought off the attack of the Prussian army in a thick fog. The French artillery fired fiercely, while the soldiers sang the national anthem, the Marseillaise, in unison, and chanted "Long live the nation." Faced with that spirit, combined with disease and food shortages, the Prussian army was forced to retreat. The Battle of Valmy ended with a few hundred casualties, but it was the first victory of the revolutionary army against the feudal coalition of Europe. It proved to the French people that they could defend themselves. The next day, September 21st, 1792, the French National Assembly officially declared the abolition of the monarchy and established the First Republic. Valmy therefore became a symbol of national strength and revolutionary pride. From here on, a series of social reforms were carried out, being both radical and extreme. On September 22nd, the Catholic calendar was abolished, replaced by the French Republican calendar. With the year 1792 considered year 1, each year had 12 months, each month 30 days, and a week lasted 10 days. The goal of this reform was to erase the influence of religion and royal power, affirming the new order of reason and the Republic. The biggest question at this time was the fate of King Louis XVI. The moderate faction wanted to spare his life to avoid outraging the European monarchies, while the radical faction demanded the king be executed for treason. The vote in the National Assembly ended with a decision to execute Louis XVI. On January 21st, 1793, at the Revolution Square, the king was executed by the guillotine at the age of 38. The guillotine, a symbol of fairness and humanity of the new era, was believed to bring a faster and less painful death compared to torture or hanging. But for Europe, this was a horrific shock. Even Britain, which once had sympathy for the French Revolution, condemned this as a sacrilegious crime. The war continued to escalate with no end in sight. As the war spread, the Girondin faction hoped it would strengthen national spirit and protect the revolution. On the contrary, the conflict only deepened the crisis. Many regions like the Vendée, Toulon, Bordeaux, and coastal cities rose up against the revolutionary government with support from the British Navy. The French army, commanded by General Dumouriez, suffered continuous defeats. He himself even defected to the Austrian side, making the situation even more desperate. To salvage the situation, the Republican government issued a mass conscription order to mobilise the power of the people, something that only revolutionary France, with its boiling national spirit, could do at this time. However, the majority of the new soldiers were untrained, turning the army into a mob, lacking discipline and organisation. Many deserted or looted, tarnishing the government's reputation. Facing this crisis, the Girondin faction established the Committee of Public Safety with almost absolute power to control order, but in reality, it was to eliminate political opponents. They started by prosecuting the radical journalist Jean-Paul Marat, only to end up having to acquit him under the pressure of opposition. This action caused their prestige to plummet severely. In early June 1793, using the excuse that the Girondins were abusing their power and plotting a coup, the Montagnards within the Jacobin faction, combined with the Parisian masses, surrounded the National Assembly and arrested the Girondin leaders. From here on, political power fell into the hands of Robespierre. In that same year, he drafted the Constitution of 1793, declaring many freedoms and equality, but due to the state of emergency, France was not yet able to implement it. After the assassination of Marat by a Girondin supporter, the Jacobin faction suspended the constitution in October 1793 and established a provisional revolutionary government. At this time, Robespierre ordered a second mass conscription, and thanks to better organisation, the revolutionary army gradually regained the initiative, retaking Lyon and Bordeaux, and pushing back the royalists along the borders. From here, France entered the phase of revolutionary terror, with power completely concentrated in the hands of Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety. In Toulon, this city had been captured by the British and blockaded by sea. But through the brilliant command of an artillery officer named Napoleon Bonaparte, the French were able to retake this place. Few knew that this battle would serve as the starting point for the rise of Napoleon, the man who would eventually make all of Europe tremble. The Spy Room has also made a video about Napoleon Bonaparte. If you are interested, you can also look up this video to watch. The Reign of Terror. Initially, the Committee of Public Safety was established with the goal of resolving the crisis and protecting the young republic. But before long, fear, suspicion and extremism once again crept into the heart of the revolution. The National Assembly enacted strict economic control measures, imposing price ceilings, punishing speculators and hoarders, and passing the law of suspects, allowing citizens to denounce and arrest anyone deemed an enemy of freedom. In just 10 months, about 300,000 people were arrested, 16,000 people were executed, and over 40,000 others died in prison, all while being escorted. A chilling picture of the price of revolutionary ideals. From being a tool of the National Assembly, the Committee of Public Safety gradually became a centre of absolute power. By October 10, 1793, the National Assembly officially recognised the committee as the supreme government, allowed to suspend the constitution until peace was restored. That meant there was no longer any mechanism that could restrain Robespierre and his associates. From mid-October, Robespierre and two close confidants, Saint-Just and Couthon, began carrying out a large-scale purge right inside the revolutionary ranks. Queen Marie Antoinette was sent to the guillotine. Next were the leaders of the Girondin faction. The execution spread across France, from Paris to the provinces, where thousands of people were put to death on charges of counter-revolution. Among them, the massacres in Nantes commanded by General Jean-Baptiste Carrier became one of the most savage crimes. Over 4,000 civilians, mostly women, children and clergy, were tied up and then drowned in the Loire River. The brutality of the Jacobin faction fractured the very core of the revolution. An extremist faction led by the journalist Jacques Hébert called for the elimination of Christianity and the establishment of atheism. The other faction, led by Georges Danton, advocated for reconciliation and an end to the violence. But Robespierre, in his obsession with revolutionary purity, ordered the execution of both factions, including Danton, who was once a close comrade and friend. This event marked the turning point of fear. Robespierre went from being the saviour of the country to becoming the symbol of terror. In 1794, Robespierre's power reached the peak of despotism. He enacted new laws, stripping the right of defence from the accused, turning the revolutionary tribunals into tools for immediate execution. In the same year, he established the cult of the Supreme Being, an effort to replace Christianity with a moral religion of the Republic. But instead of strengthening faith, this initiative made both allies and enemies suspect that Robespierre was crowning himself the Messiah of the Revolution. In June 1794, when the French army under the command of Jean-Baptiste Jourdan and Saint just won a resounding victory at Fleurus, pushing back the Austro-Prussian coalition and capturing the Low Countries, which is modern-day Belgium and the Netherlands. The threat of foreign invasion decreased significantly, but right then internal fear erupted. Associates in the Committee of Public Safety, terrified that they would become the next victims of the guillotine, secretly allied to oppose Robespierre. The climax occurred on July 27, 1794, when Robespierre spoke up, threatening that all traitors to the revolutionary ideals would be punished. That declaration sent the entire National Assembly into a panic, because no one could know if they would be the next traitor. That very night, the National Assembly ordered the arrest of Robespierre and his allies. The next day, July 28, 1794, it was Robespierre's turn to be executed at the Revolution Square, closing the Reign of Terror. His death also marked the disintegration of the Jacobin faction and paved the way for a new political era that was equally unstable. The rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. Although Robespierre's reign of terror had ended, France still could not find political stability. In the south, counter-revolutionary forces rose up in revenge, slaughtering thousands of people suspected of being Jacobins. Meanwhile, new leaders of the National Assembly, such as Barras and Joseph Fouché, tried to soothe religious conflicts and heal society. On the foreign policy front, France achieved many military successes, signing peace treaties with Prussia and Spain, while establishing the Batavian Republic in the Netherlands, firmly consolidating its northern borders. However, the domestic situation kept getting worse. The prolonged war caused famine, crop failures, and widespread riots in Paris, while the currency devalued severely. When the remaining Jacobin elements were purged, the National Assembly reformed the government following the ancient Roman model and established a bicameral system. Right upon its formation, the Directory government had to face internal crises, economic recession, and endless warfare. The bicameral mechanism proved ineffective, and the directors lacked actual power and support within the councils, often having to resort to oppression and the use of force to maintain order. Moving into 1795, the royalist faction rebelled again, threatening the government. On October 5th, a riot broke out in Paris, but was crushed by force by Napoleon Bonaparte, who was then just a young military officer. Previously, Napoleon had been imprisoned for having ties to the Jacobin faction. Yet this military feat helped him regain his prestige and earn the trust of the directors. Even so, the Directory government continued to be weakened by corruption, factional division, and economic decline, leading to two major coups in 1795 and 1798. The military gradually became the sole pillar of power, forcing the directors to rely on generals to maintain their influence. Among them was Napoleon Bonaparte, who was commanding the army of Italy. Assigned the task of merely holding off the Austrian army, Napoleon unexpectedly achieved brilliant victories, defeating the Austrian army 5 times in 1 year, conquering all of northern Italy, and advancing close to Vienna. The Treaty of Campo Formio was signed in October 1797, marking the end of the War of the First Coalition against France. Those victories brought Napoleon unprecedented prestige. When the Jacobin faction began to recover its influence in the government, he was sent to command the Egyptian campaign in 1798 to threaten British trade routes and expand French influence. However, the campaign quickly fell into a stalemate, and Napoleon decided to secretly return to France to seize a political opportunity. Back home, he quickly gained the support of the public and the army. Along with Sieyès, one of the architects of the revolution, and the help of the nobleman Talleyrand, plus his younger brother and president of the council Lucien Bonaparte, Napoleon staged a coup on November 9th, 1799, overthrowing the Directory government and establishing the consulate system. 3 consuls were appointed, namely Napoleon, Sieyès, and Pierre-Roger Ducos, but true power lay entirely in the hands of Napoleon, who controlled both the military and the government. In reality, he had become the military dictator of France. After the victory at Marengo in 1800 against the Austrian army, Napoleon was honoured as first consul for life, cementing his absolute power. By May 1804, he declared himself emperor, officially giving birth to the French Empire. The French Revolution, which began with the promise of liberty, equality, and fraternity, had come to an end. Although it started with much promise, the promise of freedom was quickly overshadowed by fear, leading to atrocities and a state of chaos that lasted for 10 consecutive years. And by the time the French Empire was established, the revolution that once made all of Europe shake had ended, ushering in a new era, the era of Napoleon. The French Revolution was over, but the era of turmoil for all of Europe was just beginning with Napoleon Bonaparte becoming emperor. Regarding the life and legendary wars of Napoleon, the channel has also created a detailed and comprehensive video series. If our beloved audience is interested, you can look it up to learn more. As for the content of this video about the events of the French Revolution, we will wrap it up here. If you found this video helpful, do not forget to like, share, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you will not miss other similar content in the future. And for now, goodbye and see you later.